and welcome to the channel. This is the second of the 3 videos where the people who watch the channel selected the movies from a list I gave them. And this time around you guys did well. 3 movies are coherently themed. They're all interesting films and they all have something to say about the human condition, each in their own way. As you know, all 3 of them are based around books that I showed to the viewers, and the votes were put in and I tallied them up and I selected the top 10 to review for the channel, and here are the second 3. So we're going to start out with the least of the 3, which isn't to say the movie is bad, because it's not. It's a quirky little William Castle directed film which doesn't get a lot of mention when people are talking about the movies of William Castle. And the movie from 1964 is The Night Walker, starring Barbara Stanwyck, Robert Taylor, Hayden Rourke and Lloyd Bochner. And there's a little bit from the film on the back there. Now this is a messed up little movie. It's got a short runtime. It runs about 80 minutes at the most. I'll put the exact number there. And it starts out with a kind of cool looking montage about the nature of dreams, even though ultimately the movie's not about dreams. It does this 3 or 4 minute monologue with a narration by Paul Frees about the nature of dreams, and that if you die in your dreams, you die in real life. That hasn't happened because I died in my dream once and I'm still here. So they've obviously padded the running time with that. And also, this was the last movie Universal Studios made in black and white before they shifted all of their production over to colour. So it's a bit of a pivot point in the history of that particular studio. As the cover indicates, it was written by Robert Bloch, who also wrote Psycho and of course had a lot of cachet in Hollywood for that. He didn't go on to have a very prominent career in Hollywood, but he had a steady one for a couple of decades after Psycho was made by Hitchcock. But this one has some really messed up psychology in it and messed up male privilege. And yes, I'm going to get somebody calling me woke for saying male privilege, but just wear it, okay? But every time I mention male privilege or toxic masculinity on the channel, I usually get a couple of people living in their mum's basement who give me bad comments on it. So let's get it out of the way. It's full of toxic masculinity. It's full of male privilege. I'm saying that for 2 reasons. 1, it's true. 2, it cheeses off a number of people who comment on the channel and they call me woke and they call me a communist, and they kind of do all sorts of amusing things which I then post on Facebook for the amusement of my friends. Having said that, the movie starts out with a blind inventor played by Hayden Rourke, who people remember played Dr. Bellows in I Dream of Jeannie, but he was a solid character actor. If you look at his other roles, he's got quite a nice career there. He's married to a woman called Irene, played by Barbara Stanwyck. Barbara Stanwyck at the time was 57 years old. Keep that in mind because it makes things much more interesting. She is having erotic dreams at night and talking in her sleep, and this is cheesing off her older blind husband, who then tape records her dreams and plays them for his lawyer, played by Robert Taylor. So not only is he kind of breaching her privacy by recording the audio of her erotic dreams, he's playing it for another guy because he wants this other guy to find out who this man his wife is dreaming about actually is. The other thing is that Robert Taylor and Barbara Stanwyck were married for a number of years, divorced in 1952. But they were a married couple, and that kind of added to the publicity for the film, but that's a side issue. Pretty soon after the movie starts, there's an explosion in a laboratory that's attached to the house, and Hayden Rourke's character Trent dies. His wife Irene then moves into an apartment attached to a beauty salon she owns, because she doesn't want to live in the house while the probate's going through for the will, and Robert Taylor's character Barry is helping her out with the will. But she still has the dreams, and she also dreams as she goes back to the house and sees her husband, and also meets the guy about whom she is having the erotic dreams, played by Lloyd Bochner. Now this one's kind of a twisted little movie in so many ways. So who's the audience for this film? Is it kind of women? Is it a women's film with some horror aspects and also with a little touch of murder mystery about it. There are some parallels you can make between this film and the German Krimi films of the time, and also Gialli as well, the Italian Giallo films. It's got a little bit of the flavour of both of those things in it. And it's kind of messed up in so many ways. I'm not going to do spoilers, but there is some nice makeup work in the film. And there are times when the movie makes you wonder where reality ends and where the dreams of Irene begin. So it does have, it's got a slightly Lynchian flavour about it. It's a touch of David Lynch there. It's not a great film by any means. It's very much a very kind of artificial film. A lot of it's shot on the backlots and the studios in Universal. And it's very much a lesser William Castle film, but it's kind of interesting. If you dive into the psychology of the characters, there's some pretty messed up stuff there. Now, Robert Taylor was never a good actor. He was a pretty actor in the 1930s when he was young. He was a solid leading man in the 40s and early 50s when he was slightly older. But he was as stiff as a teenage boy on Viagra. He was incredibly stiff, and he gave nothing to the actors he was playing against. Usually you can see that kind of rapport between actors when they're playing dialogue scenes. But Robert Taylor was as stiff as hell. He's probably one of my least favourite Hollywood leading men of the 1930s and 40s. Just, there's nothing behind the eyes. But leaving that aside, it's a kind of quaint little Universal film. It's one that it's had a Blu-ray release recently in the US, and I'd like to get that, I think, because I want to see what the extras are and what the commentary tracks say about this twisted little film. But thank you to the people who voted for this one, because they like William Castle mostly. It's a nice start because it's about psychological manipulation of a woman by men. And that then leads me to the second film that people selected for the top 10 list. Gaslight, from 1944, starring Ingrid Bergman, Charles Boyer and Joseph Cotten. And this one's much more interesting. This one's actually a novelisation of the original play by Patrick Hamilton by a guy called William Drummond. So it's a book based on a play that became a movie as well. And before I get into that, one of the interesting things we get with paperbacks in Australia of certain vintages, they were often stamped by second-hand bookshops that sold them to people. So there's one in Bundaberg, Queensland. So this one's travelled at least 2,000 kilometres to get to me. And there's another one from a place called Books and Bounties, which had a selling price of $2 way back in the day. This is the paperback library edition. But I found that interesting because this is one of the books that my friend Ivor gave me. He was living in Darwin at the time. For some reason, the movie migrated across the north of Australia from Bundaberg, Queensland to Darwin. Gaslight's an interesting movie for a number of reasons, one of which is a gaslit, a previous version of itself. And yes, the term gaslighting comes from this movie, even though technically the gaslight that's mentioned in the movie's title is a clue towards solving the mystery rather than being the mystery itself, but we'll leave that aside for now. There was a previous version of this movie made in 1940 in England, starring Anton Walbrook and Diana Wynyard, and that was quite popular. But then Patrick Hamilton sold the rights to his play to MGM, and MGM made a movie about it, and they tried to buy up all the prints and the original negatives of the 1940 version of this film so that their movie wouldn't be mistaken for another movie and that nobody else could then re-release the 1940 movie and take away some of the juice from the 1944 MGM version. They didn't succeed for a very odd reason. Some of the cans for the original prints of the 1940 version were titled with the name of the original play, which was Angel Street. So a few copies of the film remained under the title of Angel Street, and MGM wasn't able to totally obliterate the previous iteration of this story from the face of the earth, and prints were then made from the prints of Angel Street, and we now to this day have copies of the original version of the movie Gaslight starring Anton Walbrook. That's why physical copies matter. Nobody can destroy a movie anymore. The movie starts out 10 years before the main action, when there's a strangulation murder on Thornton Square, and a very prominent opera singer who has a niece that she is looking after is murdered by an unknown assailant. The niece, played by Ingrid Bergman, wants to be an opera singer as well. She moves to Italy for 10 years and takes lessons, and falls in love with the piano player of her singing tutor, who's a guy called Gregory Anton, played by Charles Boyer. He proposes to her. She decides she wants to go back to England and think it through for a little bit before she decides. He follows her to England, meets her on the train. They decide to get married and move into the house of her aunt on Thornton Square in London. There's a really dotty neighbour played by Dame Mae Whitty, who's quite amusing in the film, and kind of leavens the drama and the kind of darkness of the rest of the film with her comic turn. So they move into the house and settle in, and Gregory starts manipulating the young woman, whose name is Paula, by doing things that convince her she's going mad. He steals things from her and implies that she's lost them. He tells her things and tells her that he's told her these things before, but she's forgotten. He also kind of undermines her self-value by isolating her. Whenever she wants to go out and do something, he'll find a way to convince her that she's having a relapse. And she's kind of trapped in this house with her two servants, one of whom is a maid called Anna, who is hearing impaired. And there's also a new saucy young maid called Nancy, played by Angela Lansbury in her first film role, who kind of flirts with Gregory and is not adverse to the attentions of young men. Gregory has reasons to start undermining Paula's mental health. She starts seeing things. The gaslight fades at unusual hours of the night. She hears bumps and noises around the house where there shouldn't be bumps and noises. And meanwhile, a young police officer, played by Joseph Cotton, decides to reopen the cold case of the aunt's murder and starts unravelling what's actually happening here. This was a difficult film for Ingrid Bergman to make because Ingrid Bergman was a strong Swedish woman. Playing a character who is mentally weak and is able to be manipulated and gaslit by a man was a real ask for her. She actually went to mental homes and talked to women who were suffering from mental illness so she could get a better handle on how to play the role. So she actually went the distance. She didn't go method. She just did her research to try to find a valid way of playing this character. In fact, she won a Best Actress Oscar for it. And Charles Boyer, who was like a French romantic actor of the previous decade, is good. He plays both sides of Gregory really well, the kind of romantic and attentive Gregory, and the evil and manipulative one at the same time. He is the first real solid undermining male in cinema. It was a real eye-opener for many people to see A, that Charles Boyer could act a villain, and B, to have this kind of character. The stage play Angel Street was incredibly popular for that reason, because undoubtedly there were many women who saw the stage play and who saw the movie Gaslight who realised in their own lives that they were being manipulated by the men in their lives. And it's something that men did. My own father was very much that kind of a person. So there's a kind of groundedness to the psychology of this film that I found really interesting and intriguing. I haven't rewatched the 1940 version for a very long time, and I will do that because I think that comparing and contrasting two different versions from two different sides of the Atlantic Ocean is a valid thing to do. But this version of Gaslight works really well. There are so many nice bits of business. MGM had a lot of money to throw at this movie. Things like the bric-a-brac that fills this kind of Edwardian era house, which adds to the claustrophobia of the imprisonment, the psychological imprisonment that Paula has. Works really well. the intelligence and the kind of integrity of the Joseph Cotton character, who in the original version and the original stage play was an older police inspector, but for MGM's purposes was made into a younger character as a potential future romantic interest for Paula, because MGM was always sentimental about these things. I mean, I don't know what it's like where you live, but here there's a lot of news media which covers the ways in which men can abuse women without hitting them. And this movie is maybe the first step in a public discussion about that kind of abuse. And that makes it really interesting for me. Gaslighting has become part of our vocabulary. And because of the way that Gregory, the character, manipulates Paula and undermines her and exerts financial control over her and psychological control over her and undermines her self-worth and her joy in the world. All of that stuff's in this film, and it really does land the film well to a modern audience. I don't think there's a reasonable person who didn't want to punch the shit out of Gregory by the time this movie was over. But the nice thing it does, and I think the saving grace of the film, which could have gone very differently because MGM was, as I said, sentimental, is the confrontation between Paula and Gregory at the end of the film when she has the upper hand. I think that is really Ingrid Bergman's influence, and it gives her that closure she needs to move on from the horrible travails she's had to undergo at the hands of this nasty piece of work. And there are other little bits of business. The fact that Paula is more egalitarian than Gregory is. Gregory doesn't treat the servants very well, but Paula wants to, but is undermined by him when she tries to treat the maids with a certain amount of civility and with a certain care. I like that too. I like the fact that there's a ideological war going on amongst the two of them, as much as there is several other kinds of antagonism. And I also like the way that as the noose closes in, Gregory becomes increasingly irrational, and the narrative flips to show his mental illness as the main focus of the film, rather than the mental degradation that Paula undergoes. It's a very subtly written script, and I really appreciate it for that. And from 1944, we move on to 1974. And the second movie in what's known as Alan J. Pakula's Paranoid Trilogy. The first one was Clute. The third one in 1976 was All the President's Men. And the second one is his 1974 conspiracy thriller, The Parallax View. Starring Warren Beatty, Paula Prentice, Hume Cronin, William Daniels, Bill McKinney, and a bunch of other people. Now, I've got to thank Damien, one of the people who supports the channel on Patreon, who I also known for many years, who ended up with 2 copies of the imprint Blu-ray of this because he bought 2 by accident and gave me one for free. He sent it all the way across the country from Western Australia to here in Melbourne, so that I've got the really good Blu-ray edition that has been put out by Imprint, one of my favourite DVD releasing and Blu-ray releasing companies. This one's got a 4K restoration from an original 35mm camera negative, 2 commentaries, one by Kevin Lyons, one from Blake Howard. It's got Kim Newman on Parallax View and conspiracy thrillers, Matthew Sweet on the Parallax View, a video essay by Chris O'Neill, and the theatrical trailer. So there's a ton of extras on this one. And the movie itself is fantastic, based on the novel by Lauren Singer. It's a really nicely made film. I don't think it was made on an enormous budget either. It was kind of economically made. But the story is that a senator who's running for president is assassinated on the top of the Space Needle in Seattle. By the way, I've been to the Space Needle. When I went there in '98, they had really shit coffee. But he gets assassinated there, and a bunch of people are witness to this. And the people who are witness to it suddenly start dying off in accidental circumstances. Now, 2 of them, one is a woman called Lee Carter, played by Paula Prentice, and a kind of middle-range journalist called Joe Frady, played by Warren Beatty, were among the people who were there at the time. Lee comes to Joe 3 years later and says, everybody else is dying. I'm really afraid I'm going to die. We need to find out what's happening here. There's a conspiracy. Even though they said it was a lone gunman who killed the senator, there's a conspiracy, and I'm very afraid. And Frady decides, with the reluctant assistance of his publisher, played wonderfully by Hume Cronin, to try to find out what's going on and to try to find the other people who were in the photos taken at the time of the murder, who were still alive and who are under threat from whoever or whatever is causing this conspiracy. Joe goes undercover to try to find this out and tries to get himself recruited by the mysterious Parallax Corporation, which we find out pretty soon is in the business of recruiting psychopaths for political and industrial assassinations. Now, I'm not going to go too much further into that aspect of the film, but there are just so many really nice scenes in this film. There's some scenes with a behavioural psychologist, played by Anthony Zerbe, who's a friend of Joe's and helps him out with a questionnaire the Parallax Corporation puts out to potential hirees, where the groovy thing is you see Anthony Zerbe sitting in there playing a game of Pong on a Pong console from the 1970s with a chimpanzee. Now, there's something about that I just love. He helps Joe out. There's a really tense scene on a crowded airplane, which is really a masterclass in how to show rather than tell action. And that works incredibly well. The movie has such an interesting mise-en-scène. It's the kind of austere 1970s corporate environments we see in this film are intensely creepy. And the dialogue is sometimes spoken softly, so you've got to lean in and listen very carefully to it, which is a deliberate choice that Pakula made to kind of get the audience to lean in. And a lot of the scenes are shot as if the camera is an unseen observer to the action, rather than being a tool for telling a story. So there are a lot of long shots and mid shots, which are kind of peek out from the side of buildings and things like that. And then we get the bravura moment in this film. And then we get the montage. The montage when they're doing galvanic skin responses on Joe as they try to recruit him, and show him a montage of words and images, basically to find out whether the character is actually a psychopath. And I'm not going to tell you much about that, but that few minutes in the film of still images just kind of thrown up on the screen with some music in the background is creepy as hell. It starts out slow and easy with motherhood statements and cute pictures and things like that, and then it just accelerates into madness. If you haven't seen that part, this movie is worth it just for those few minutes. It really is a crazily well thought out montage, and probably one of the best montages in cinema history. The other groovy thing is that Joe Frady, the character played by Warren Beatty, is a bit of an emptiness in the centre of the film. Yeah, they tell us that he's a kind of rough diamond. He's a loose cannon in the organisation. He could be a much more prominent journalist if it wasn't for the fact that he was such a loose cannon. But the way Beatty plays it with his kind of all-American good looks and an empty face is kind of something that plays well into the last act of the film. Joe Frady, we don't find out too much about him and who he is, what he is. But we go on this journey with him to an ultimate conclusion, which is very interesting and makes us reevaluate the character we've seen throughout the movie in a very dark and really creepy way, which I love. I love the fact that they chose an actor like Warren Beatty, who's got a kind of facile charm about him, but was never a particularly deep actor, to play this investigative journalist who is so far out of his depth the snorkel wouldn't help him. This is one of the great kind of thrillers of the 1970s and doesn't get enough love. I mean, people talk about Chinatown, they talk about other movies, But the Parallax View, along with The Conversation, Francis Ford Coppola's movie, would be my double feature paranoid conspiracy thriller movie selections were I to choose it for, say, a double feature in a cinema. It's shot beautifully. The scenes are chosen well. The locations are chosen superbly. And the story unravels in such an interesting way that I was riveted all the way through it. Didn't pause it once, didn't go for a toilet break, didn't go to get a cup of coffee, nothing. I sat through it rock solid all the way through on the 4K TV. And it fascinated me from the first frame to the last. So that's the second 3 of the movies selected by the viewers. Thank you very much for watching. Sunday is my birthday, so if you haven't yet, as a birthday present, please subscribe to the channel. You can like the video, you can hit the notification bell to hear about future videos. I've got another video coming up on Wednesday, which I think is going to be science fiction. And on Saturday, I'm going to select the 3rd of the movie reviews chosen by the viewers. And that's going to be fun because I already know what they are, and I'll give you the whole list and how all 31 movies were rated by the voting from the viewers on Saturday. And I'm so looking forward to that one. So anyway, look after yourselves. Stay safe. Don't eat too many chocolate eggs. Watch some good movies. Watch some bad movies. Take care of yourselves. And I'll catch you next time.